Welcome back. Today we're going to continue on with our chemical review, moving on into Chapter 3, which is dealing with organic chemistry. As we continue our chemical review, we're going to step away from water here for a few moments and look at all chemicals in general. And chemists divide the chemical world into two basic groups or categories. The first of those categories refer to inorganic chemicals. And inorganic chemicals, by definition, are chemicals that don't contain any carbon. And so out of those 100-plus elements in our chemical natural world around us, if it is missing carbon, it would be an inorganic chemical. Now, inorganic chemicals are usually relatively small. They're usually not particularly complicated. Things like water, salt, like sodium chlorine, acids and bases, those all are inorganic chemicals. Organic chemicals, on the other hand, are our other category, and organic chemicals obviously then are going to contain carbon. And so anything that contains carbon would be organic. By comparison, these organic chemicals are often extremely large and much more complex, certainly a lot more complex chemistry associated with organic chemicals. Now, as we look at living things, obviously inorganic chemicals are important. Water and salt and acids and bases all impact living things in a very dramatic way. But it's the organic chemicals, or the carbon-containing chemicals, that actually physically make up our structure, that make up our cell shape, the organelles inside of our cells, and so on, all made up of organic chemicals. So that's where we're going to focus our review today. And if we look at this categorization, inorganic versus organic, no carbon versus carbon, it certainly begs the question, why carbon? Out of 100 different elements, why is carbon so important that we separate chemicals? We don't separate chemicals on whether or not they have oxygen or not, or hydrogen or not, or calcium or not. It's just carbon. And so there must be something unique or special about carbon that we use it to divide all of our different chemicals up. First off, it's a very flexible chemical. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell, which means its outer shell is half full. Remember that outer shell contains up to 8 electrons. So carbon is going to need 4 more electrons to fill up its outer shell. Now it's going to be involved in those covalent sharing bonds, and carbon can form any combination of covalent bonds that adds up to 4. It could be 4 single bonds. It could be 2 double bonds, 2 doubles and 2 singles, a triple and a single, any combination. And so again, it's a very flexible chemical that can bind to several other atoms all at the same time. And so here we can see that, for example, in methane, we see carbon with 4 single bonds to hydrogens. In addition, carbon is very abundant, and it's also very small, which allows it to form more bonds because of the angles of the bonds are allowed at such a small atom. And so all 3 of these things combined, its flexibility, abundance, and size, all make carbon a very sort of special atom in terms of organic or inorganic classifications. So if we take a look at organic chemicals and organic chemistry, they're often made by living organisms. That's kind of our major feature about organic chemicals. Not all are. Certainly methane gas is produced by volcanic activity as well, but most organic chemicals are associated with life and living organisms. And if we look at the general structure of organic chemicals, they have 2 major pieces or parts. One is the carbon skeleton, the other are what are called functional groups. And so we're going to take a quick look at carbon skeletons and functional groups and how they're going to combine to make an organic chemical. The bulk of the size and the weight of a organic chemical is going to come from the carbon skeleton. And the carbon skeleton basically are long chains or sometimes rings of carbons and hydrogens hooked together. And hydrogen is our most abundant element out there in nature, and we almost always see it associated with carbons. And so while carbon is technically our definition of an organic chemical, organic chemicals are certainly going to contain many, many hydrogens. And if we look at our chart, we can see, again, the flexibility of carbon. We can have long chains of carbons, and they can be straight like this butane, or they can be branched like isobutane, where we've got some carbons branching off to the side. They may be all single bonds, or we may see some double bonds like we see in butene. And those double bonds could be at the end of the chain, or they could be at the middle. If the 2 ends of the carbon chain hook together, then we end up with a ring. And we can have cyclohexane, a single bond, or something like benzene, which has both single and double bonds combined. So again, carbon is extremely flexible, and this carbon-hydrogen skeleton is going to form the weight and really the general size and structure of our organic chemical. Now, the big important thing about the carbon skeleton is that it's going to be very, very nonpolar, that the carbons and hydrogens are involved in the equal sharing covalent bonds. And so there aren't going to be any electrical charges associated with these carbon skeletons, so they're certainly going to be very hydrophobic. They're not going to mix very well with water because they don't have any charges. And here's just some examples, again, of these carbon chains. Here we can see in the palmitic acid a long chain of carbons and hydrogens with all single bonds. And then we can see an example here of a carbon chain with some double bonds thrown in as well. So again, it's going to make the bulk of the chemical and be very, very hydrophilic. Now, attached to this carbon skeleton making up the framework of the organic chemical are going to be smaller chemical groups that are called functional groups. And a functional group then is going to be any other chemical other than hydrogens or carbons that we're going to attach to the carbon skeleton. And there are literally hundreds of different chemical groups that might get attached or stuck to these different carbon skeletons. And certainly depending on which chemical groups and how many of each group are added to the carbon skeleton, that's going to significantly alter the chemistry and the chemical properties of that organic chemical. And here's a chart from your book. This is just a few of the common different functional groups. That OH, we said that hydroxyl group, if we attach that to a carbon skeleton, that's an alcohol group. We know, for example, that oxygen is involved in lots of polar bonds. It's not a very good sharing molecule. And so, for example, if I take that carbon skeleton by itself, it's very hydrophobic. But if I attach that alcohol group to it and mix it with water, then it's going to be very soluble. Water is going to be attracted to that OH, and so I've changed the chemical properties of my organic chemical by adding it. Here we can see something like the aldehydes, a double bond of oxygen at the end of a chain, ketones, double bond oxygen in the middle. Sometimes we have combination of these. That carboxylic acid is a hydroxyl group and a double bonded oxygen. So again, carbon is very, very flexible. Not all of the functional groups contain oxygen. Here we can see an amino group at the bottom. It contains nitrogen. And so depending on what we attach, we're going to affect the chemistry of these organic chemicals. And certainly many organic chemicals, because they're so large and complex, will have many different functional groups associated with them. As we take a broad look at organic chemistry, one of the things that we'll see is there's a wide variety of chemicals, from simple chemicals like methane or butane with just a couple carbons in it, to very, very complex chemicals like gasoline or kerosene. One particular type of organic chemical or category would be macromolecules. Macromolecules are some of the largest of all the organic chemicals, and so they're extremely large. They contain many, many carbons, usually in very, very long chains, or occasionally they may be in ring structure. Macromolecules are chemicals that are certainly made by living organisms. And so as we think of chemicals that your cells are constantly producing, most of those chemicals would fall into the category of the macromolecules. Now, these macromolecules are extremely important in your cell structure in terms of your cell shape and size and what it looks like, which of course is directly going to relate to cell function. What exactly is it that your cell can do? And as we look at the human body, for example, we're made up of over 100 different types of cells. What makes each cell type different? If I was comparing, for example, a cell in the cartilage, maybe in your kneecap, to a cell, a nervous cell in your central nervous system, what makes them different are the types of macromolecules that we find. And it's those macromolecules that give them their distinct shape, structure, and function. All of these macromolecules have some similar things in common, and one common thing is that they're all built through what's called a monomer-polymer construction. And we'll take a look at this polymer-monomer construction here in just a second. In addition, they're built the same way and they're torn down the same way. They're broken down the same way. They're all built through a process called dehydration synthesis. This is a chemical process where we're going to take out water, hence the name dehydration. We're removing water when we synthesize or build these chemicals. Likewise, if your cells need to tear down or to break down and get rid of these chemicals, all these macromolecules are broken down through a process called hydrolysis. Hydro for water, lysis for breaking. So it's just the opposite. We're going to add water back to these chemicals to metabolically tear them apart or break them down. So let's take a look more in depth at these macromolecules. Macromolecules do have this polymer-monomer construction, and so let's take a look at that. A monomer just means a single unit, mono for one and mer for unit. So a single unit. Now, as we look at these macromolecules, a monomer or a single unit is actually one organic chemical. That monomer could be a ring of carbons with lots of hydrogens and a couple of functional groups attached, or it could be a carbon-hydrogen chain with one or more functional groups. And so the monomer by itself is actually a pretty complex chemical. But with these macromolecules, what our cells will do is take these monomers, these single units, and start hooking them together into long chains. And so polymer just means many, and so we've got many units for our polymer. And so some of these macromolecules may be thousands of monomers, thousands of small organic chemicals all attached to each other. And that's why these things are so large, certainly so complex. And if we take a look at just an example, here we can see each of the little numbered ovals represents a monomer, one of these organic chemicals. And so when your cell builds a monomer, it's going to connect the next monomer to the chain, and in doing so, it's going to remove the water, and so the chain or the polymer can get longer. This example shows 4 monomers, but certainly it can be much, much longer than that. And we're going to build these, as I mentioned on the last slide, through dehydration synthesis. We're going to take out water, we're going to dehydrate it, and then we're going to synthesize. We're building the chemical here. And so as we can see in the diagram, we're chemically removing the water every time we attach a monomer to our chain. Anytime then we're going to have a meal, for example, we're going to hit the drive-thru and grab a cheeseburger and some fries, we're taking in lots and lots of these macromolecules. And so our bodies have to be able to digest these macromolecules to break them apart, releasing energy, but also recycling some of those nutrients that our cell may need. And we do that through a chemical process called hydrolysis. And so hydrolysis is the breaking down of a polymer into its monomers. So basically we're going to break off one monomer at a time as we break this large chemical apart. And every time we do so, we're going to have to add some water. And so we're going to have to hydrate it, hence hydrolysis in this process. And so here we can see a polymer, a long chain. We're going to add a water to it, and that's going to break off one monomer. We can add a second water and break off another monomer, and we're going to repeat that process. And certainly this is a large part of our digestion, again, as we break down foods, breaking those macromolecules into smaller monomers, and then our cells can process those monomers in many, many different metabolic pathways. So we've discussed several things that all of these different macromolecules have in common. Hydrolysis to tear them down, dehydration synthesis to build them, that polymer-monomer construction. But there are different types of macromolecules. In particular, there are 4 different types of macromolecules in living organisms, and these different types of macromolecules are going to have very different structure and in turn very different function within your cells. And these are chemicals that I'm sure you're familiar with, things like the carbohydrates or the sugars, the lipids or fats, certainly proteins, and then finally the nucleic acids, things like DNA or RNA. And so for each of these different types of macromolecules, they all have a monomer-polymer construction we build, and we tear them down the same way. Of course, carbohydrates chemically are very different than a fat or a protein or a nucleic acid, and the reason for those differences are the monomers, that each of these different types of macromolecules have a different monomer, a different chemical building block. And so as we connect these monomers together in a sugar, for example, that's going to give that sugar very different chemical properties than by connecting different monomers together as your cells make proteins. And so we're just going to take a quick look at our different macromolecules, a little bit about the structure, what the monomer might be, but more importantly, what sort of function do we see or what sort of role do they play in cells of living organisms. So in summary of our introduction here to organic chemistry, many chemicals we know are inorganic chemicals. They tend to be small. They don't contain carbon, things like water, for example, or salt. While organic chemicals are those carbon-containing chemicals that tend to be larger, more complex. They're made up of 2 basic parts, carbon skeletons, the carbon-hydrogen part of the chemical that forms the bulk of the size and weight, and then lots of those functional groups may be attached to it, at least one, maybe several attached to each organic chemical, things like an alcohol or an OH group, for example. And a particular type of organic chemical that's important to living things are the macromolecules, those largest and most complex of the large, complex chemicals. And we know macromolecules are built by that monomer-polymer construction. We build them through dehydration synthesis. The chemical process of hydrolysis is how we break them down. And there are 4 different types, are sugars, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. And next time we'll move on and talk about those different types of macromolecules.